Hey! One thing that keeps getting requested, even though I've done a few videos on the nature of space and what it is, keep things both more simple but go a little bit more in depth, which I think would make everybody happy. Of course, space is something that Nikola Tesla, as well as relativity, railed against heavily. This is the only time that actually Nikola Tesla, I could say, gets angry in any of his known writings that we have. Of course, since space doesn't exist, but neither does a unicorn, talking about the metaphysics of space would be like talking about the metaphysics of unicorns, right? Since, unicorns don't exist and space is not a thing, but neither is a shadow. But if I were to say to you the word shadow, you instantly think of a shadow, probably, of a tree, sitting in a shadow possibly, or, walking behind somebody and taking a look down at their shadow. But shadow's not a thing. Shadow's an absence of something. But if I say unicorn, which of course doesn't exist, everybody on Earth, essentially, since we grew up with these fantasies and of course portrayed in movies and whatnot, we immediately have this image in our mind of a unicorn, right? Something that doesn't exist. Some mental machination, that a picture in our head of this one-horned beast that doesn't exist. We can conjure it up, and human beings, of the countless flaws that existential beings have, I did some painting, my hands are dry from washing my hands so much. We have an idea in our head of something, even though we know, of course, it doesn't exist. The same is true of space. I'd like to actually go into the metaphysics of space, which is not exactly like the metaphysics of unicorns. Both, of course, don't exist, but existential beings, of course, are beings that are susceptible. Space exists conventionally, but it doesn't exist ultimately. Same is true of time. Every atom, the one thing that I agree with the so-called scientists on, is that every atom is, we'll say, 99.999% empty space. An atom is just an electromagnetic dynamo. The volume measured in picometers of every atom is the loss of energy or inertia of the nucleus of that atom, the most simple of which, and of course everything is compounded hydrogen. It is true that every atom is essentially, if we were able to eliminate out, supposedly, and it's probably extremely accurate, the interatomic volume of all the atoms that make up this Earth and everybody on it, and were to reduce it to zero such that the only thing that would exist is the nucleus, supposedly entire the Earth would be something not much bigger than this. That's a lot of space. But a lot of nothing? I mean, space is nothing. We can't talk about a lot of something. We could talk about counting a lot of shadows, but we're talking about a lot of nothing, a privation, an absence of something. The ancients accurately, both the Greeks, Indians, and Egyptians, Advaita Vedanta, the Nikayas, the Upanishads, they all accurately define space infinitely closer to anything today's so-called academicians of science have actually reified space as being bendable and warpable. We all grew up with this idea of warp space-time as espoused by relativity, which is actually picked up by science fiction and postulated, the bending of space-time, wormholes, bending space. Space can no more be bent than you can bend a unicorn fart. Yeah, unicorn doesn't exist, and unicorn flatulence certainly does not exist. But maybe you think, or maybe these so-called scientists today are smarter than Tesla. And I don't base anything I'm about to say about space based upon what Tesla says, but rather facts, logic, common sense, and what is retroductively true that we could say that's palpable and demonstrable about space. Here's a couple quotes from Tesla. To say that the presence of larger bodies, that space becomes curved, is the equivalent of stating that something can act upon nothing. I, for one, refuse to subscribe to such a view. Tesla. Since action and reaction are coexistent, he means spontaneous, or IAD, instantaneous action at a distance, it follows that the supposed curvature of space is entirely impossible. People talk about empty space. That's kind of, a double negative You know, as opposed to what, a full space? If it was full, it wouldn't be space. Space is ultimately no different than a shadow. Shadow is not a thing at all, nor does a shadow exist. Neither is it a principle. It is an absence of something. A principle is something that is demonstrable, whether it be objective or subjective. This is a ball of lead. It is demonstrably objective. The soul is also, too, demonstrable, but it is not objective. It is subjective. The absence of soul, the absence of something, is not a principle. It is not in any way both subject or objectively demonstrable. Specifically getting into the metaphysics of space, you know, it's the negative image of infinity. But what do we mean by infinity? When we say infinity, people get really confused, and so me saying that just confuses people even more, because we think of infinity as an impossible distance of space, but that of course would be between two or more bodies. So we have this idea of infinity equaling space. But infinity from the standpoint of metaphysics would be pure potential, which would have no Cartesian value. It would have no x, y, z coordinate. It would not be objectively demonstrable. I like to do a clock analogy, and a clock analogy gives the people a clearer idea of something. Got a little cheap clock over there on the wall. They're all kind of run on a little AA battery. They're all cheap junk made in China, and you go to Amazon, you want a clock for your wall that's like $25 or less, or all the exact same clockworks behind whatever the face actually has on it. But sister to space is, of course, time. Neither exists ultimately, but they do exist conventionally, but neither one exists relative to the absolute. Space is, of course, a negative image of ether. You could say counter space. The 0-point energy, we could refer to the plane of inertia. But space is that negative of the ether. The magnetic field that actually surrounds a magnet, which fascinates everybody. And I was never interested in understanding magnetism because of its fascinating properties. The fact that it exists in billions of different electronic devices and whatnot is not a thing, but the field that around it will say, what's a field? Well, it's a region of influence. Well, like, that's an accurate description, but descriptions are not explanations. A field is, of course, in ether perturbation modalities. You have a region of influence because it is a point source object that is qualitative, not quantitative. Before that magnet becomes a magnet, it is quantitatively identical. The only thing that defines a magnet and the field that fascinates everybody around it is a qualitative object, which actually has this region of influence around it. We say, well, it's a region of space that's influenced, but space has no properties. The region of influence that we call the magnetic field, ab extra and around the object, of course, is the ether modality thereof. Because every field is nothing other than ether perturbation modality. In the case of ancient Pali and Sanskrit, is extremely accurate. Ka represents space or emptiness. But empty of what? That's the real question, of course. Ka means empty. Empty, though, of what? Empty, of course, of pure potential. Space, by the way, is literally the definition of samsara. Samsara means to go round and round. Samsara just means the round of suffering, life, death, birth, so on and so forth. It just means to go round and round. Sansarate, to go round and round. And round, of course, implies a circumference. A circumference which, of course, keeps spinning due to a loss of energy or inertia, which is inherent to the system. And by the system, I mean the absolute and, of course, its attribute. There's two types of emptiness, by the way, in ancient Pali and Sanskrit. There's dukkha and sukha. The suffixual ka, of course, meaning space or empty. Sukha means pleasure or bliss, not transcendental bliss as meant liberation and the wisdom thereof. Dukkha just means suffering. So you got dukkha and sukha, just like you have the antinomies. Antinomies, polar opposites, magnetic polarity. When you actually have the loss of energy or inertia, you have the three-dimensional force vector, which necessitates polarity. A magnet actually doesn't have poles. It has the inverse of counter space. The ancient passage from the Pali, which is extremely ancient and predates ancient India, not that India existed back then, is that when this is present, that is present. When this is not present, that is not present. Time does not exist at all. We, of course, all burn in the fires of time, but that's only because we're this existential being with a beginning in time, i.e. birth, and an end in time. So we're always worried about time and spending time wisely, which is perfectly fine, logical, and wise, but time does not exist ultimately at all. Time is, of course, the sister, or the brother, however you want to look at it, of course, space. Space is a negative image of pure potential. Literally the impotency of inertia, the impotency of counter space, the impotency of potential. Space specifically is a point circumference. We all know what a point is. We all, I think, know what a circumference is. This existing is one thing, a holos, a unity, a point circumference. You take a point with a pencil, and you draw out a circumference. Say you don't lift your pen up off the piece of paper. We actually take a point and we create a circumference. Specifically, it's not a circle, but a curvilinear circle. You know what a curvilinear circle is? It's just a fancy yet highly technical way of saying a vortex. But if we look at it straight down, we can see a circle, a circumference. But that's two-dimensional. Nature doesn't express herself in two-dimensionality. She expresses herself in three dimensions, so it is a curvilinear circle or a vortex. So space is a point circumference, meaning that the energy dissipation effect is a circumference. Says circumference or magnetic force vector encircles the negative image of pure potential, i.e. the ether, counter space, 0 point. I don't care what you call it. Neither does natura naturans, i.e. Mother Nature, whatever you want to call that. It makes no difference to me. Of pure potential. What is the inverse of energy? People should ask themselves questions. If they really want to know the answers to things, I mean, they truly, truly want to know. They should ask themselves questions and burn their mind and focus to a point like a laser to actually uncover the answer to these things. The secret methodology to that is retroduction. If you really, really, really want to know the answer to something, ask and ye shall receive, right? It can be known to you. You only have to want it, and you have to apply the answer, the search for the answer, correctly. The most expedient means is retroduction, an ancient lost art. So, what's the inverse of energy? Sheer potential and potency. This circle, of course, like I said, is a vortex or a curvilinear circle. And it's not a circle, it's just a three-dimensional force vector. If you want to know what a three-dimensional force vector looks like, take a piece of wire, bend it like the letter S, take each end of the S, and bend it inverse to one another. That extrapolates out the interior geometry of a torus. A torus, or a donut shape, the volume of which is space. Space is the negative image of pure potential. I'd like to give a clock analogy here in a second. Kind of make things simple. I'm not going to say dumb it down, but make it better clarity. And by the way, I'm never ever trying to use big words when I make these videos. I kind of, raise one eyebrow up when people say, oh, you're using big words. Like, no, I'm not actually. Curvilinear is not a big word. Force in motion, centrifugal, centripetal, these are not big words at all. It just means expanding your vocabulary possibly a little bit. And then, of course, the question becomes, do we really, meaning you, really, really want to know the answer to these things? It's like, oh, it's not going to make you rich. It's not going to put more money in your bank. But, I mean, the big questions, the best parts of life is having the aha moments of true discovery as to the mechanics of nature itself. So a shadow, of course, just like space, is pure impotency, the mirage of pure potential. A shadow, of course, is not a thing, rather a chasm of light. Yeah, a chasm. Most of us don't know a chasm. We think of like the Grand Canyon, and I hike to the bottom of the Grand Canyon. Oh, there's a chasm. Well, we think of a chasm as something like a shadow or a unicorn, but a chasm is the absence of something. When you look at the Grand Canyon, it's like, oh my God, what a chasm. I've hiked to the bottom of the Grand Canyon. It's a hollow, but we acknowledge it as something, but it is not something. It is the absence of something, just as time is. Time is a measure, though. Not so close to a chasm or a shadow or emptiness or space. Space, a shadow, and a chasm are all exactly the same thing. The absence of something. But we all think it's something, and science fiction has brainwashed us into believing this space. We bent space-time, sir, engage warp 9. All this, science fiction garbage. Not that I'm against anybody watching science fiction. So a shadow's not a thing at all, neither is space, rather a chasm of light, i.e. pure potential. In effect, a privation. Likewise, too, space is this chasm, but a chasm of what? Chasm of the Grand Canyon is a chasm or absence of rock, right? Well, what is space? A chasm or absence of? Sheer or pure potential, i.e. the ether, which has no Cartesian value. It has no mass or magnitude. It is not composite. We have to ask ourselves the question, if we take energy and people, once again, don't know what energy is. What would be the dissipation or loss of a minute bit of energy? Not that energy is a bit, i.e. sheer potential, which has no value of mass or magnitude. What does it do? It manifests as a force vector. Well, what's the after effect or the sister of a force vector? The creation of a chasm. It's a negative image of pure potential, i.e. the volume or the balloon of the torus itself. Think of a cheap clock. I don't know if you've ever, I got a cheap clock over here. I'm not going to go and grab it. But we flip it over, you know, it's got a cheap little Chinese box about 2 inch by 2 inch with some little cheap plastic gears in it. It's run by a AA battery. They're all the exact same garbage clock mechanism. Battery. Battery has mass and magnitude, but that's taking the analogy too far. The center of the clock, there is no time. We only measure time by looking at the hands, the second hand, the minute hand, and the hour hand, right? The energy that drives that clock, well, what? The battery, right? Don't take the analogy too far. Which reach out, of course, and create space, which would be the circumference. Now we're looking at a two-dimensional face of a clock. Nature's clock face is, of course, a curvilinear circle or a vortex. Yeah, if you look at a vortex straight down, extrapolation drawn out, you know, it looks two-dimensional. It basically looks like a circle, but if we were able to look at it accurately, it is a curvilinear circle, which means it never meets itself. Yeah? That, by the way, is the definition of the fruition of wisdom, is where either ends of the circle meet itself and there is no longer an extrapolation. There is no longer a curvilinear circle. There is no longer centrifugal divergence. There's no longer a vortex actually as manifest. But that's a matter for another discussion. So in the case of the clock, you know, the hands that reach out into space, they create a circle, two-dimensional in the case of a clock face. We actually measure this as time, and that's all time is. There is no such thing as time. Time is a measure. You know, I got a ruler over there with like 50 inches on it. Yeah, it's like this flexible ruler I use for leather work. Yeah? No. Did anybody thinks that millimeters or inches or things? Sure. Yeah, but of what? It's a measure of something. Time is no different than the numbers on that tape measure I got over there. I got 50 inches. 50 inches of what? Of leather. Oh, okay. It's a measure. Time. It's not my opinion or feeling or belief, because I am not interested in my own opinions, feelings, or belief. I'm interested in ultimate truth, facts, logic, and wisdom that is arrived at through Platonic, technically Pythagorean, retroduction, the ancient lost secret art of the ancients. Retroduction, there's actually several ancient lost arts. That's the most important one, of course. This thing which measures space, time on the clock face, the receptacle of mass and matter, creation of shadows. Once again, when this is present, that is. Isn't there a little bit of energy that's drained off that crummy little AA battery on the back of that cheesy clock made in China? Isn't that the case? The negative image of pure potential. Pure potential would be that battery. Don't take the analogy too far because the battery has mass and magnitude itself. It's composed of a few different components. We know that there's energy in the battery. However, no branch of science has ever defined the term energy or field, by the way. I will point out to you once again. Take a little bit of energy from that, and we have this manifestation of mass and magnitude, this clock face with the movement of the second and minute and hour hands, this circular expanse of space, which is not a thing. Space is a negative image of that energy of pure potential. Imagine if we took away the clock battery, the battery in the back, that little AA battery, the clock were to vanish. You know, we stick in the clock battery. Of course, clocks don't work that way. You stick in the battery, all of a sudden the clock appears. Mass and magnitude, and the measure of which we're talking about time. The loss of energy or inertia, analogous to that battery, not that it's a perfect analogy, is of course the manifestation of that which we measure, which is time, the after effect of a divergent magnetic field, i.e. space. The clock face itself, of course, being space. It has a spatial vector. It is not a curvilinear circle, but it actually has a circumference. It's two-dimensional, so we can't take the analogy too far, because nature's clock face is three-dimensional, and it is a curvilinear circle, or a vortex, if you will. All space is the after effect of the loss of energy or inertia, of the battery of the ether. We say the ether is the battery, if you will. I think this might clear things up in a lot of people's heads to understand things better. So The unseen battery, pure potential. Every atom is mostly space. But space is not a thing, the boundary of which, measured in picometers, is the circumference of the magnetodielectric dynamo. Neither space nor time have any quantity or implicit inherent natures by which to cause acceleration of masses towards each other. Only a mass itself, a dielectric condensate, has the property to impel acceleration. This is increasing inertia and acceleration. In nature's clock, the energy dissipates back into the battery because nature's system has perfect efficiency, or as someone would say, energy is never created or destroyed, only transferred. Well, nature's energy is always transferred back into itself because the three-dimensional force vector that extrapolates out the creation of space, the after effect of a divergent magnetic field, vanishes back again. Yep. Kind of like nature's water comes from an unseen place. Don't take the analogy too far. Out of the shower head, and it eventually, it cleans you off, but it vanishes right back down the drain again. Of course, it gets processed by the water treatment plants and whatnot, but that's taking the analogy too far. But nature's energy always vanishes back down the drain, which is ultimately no different from that where it comes out. Of course, don't take that analogy too far. I know the drain goes to the sewer system and the water, don't take the analogy too far, which people are likely to do. This is space. Space has no properties. It has attributes. A shadow has attributes. Stand in a shadow, you feel colder than when you're standing in the sun. Well, a shadow is something. I'm standing in it. No, you're standing in the absence of light. You say, when light is absent, I feel colder. Human beings really suffer big time reifying things that don't exist. Space, time, shadows, emptiness, all these things do not exist at all. Mother Nature has never heard of these things. These are silly little concepts and ideas that human beings dreamt up. So this is what space is, and the ancients knew exactly what it was. It's defined very clearly by the Pythagoreans, Advaita Vedanta, the Nikayas, Upanishads, Plotinus, Numenius, Syrianus, Iamblichus, Proclus, on and on and on. But people don't listen. I hope you liked this video. I hope it kept it nice and concise. If you ever want to contact me, just go to my description. I have links to tons of free articles and books, including any donation. I hope you liked the video. Let me know if you have any questions. I read every comment. Lux Veritas.